Hello, I'm Sid Melcher, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I welcome you to today's Instant Issues Online event. I'd like to begin by thanking our event sponsors, Glen Meadow, Sir Speedy, and Wilbraham and Munson Academy. And again, we remain grateful to NAI Plotkin and 1350 Main Street LLC, which provides us with office and event space. Speaking of event space, we are in the process of scheduling in-person events again in April and May, our first in 2 years. As details are finalized, they will be shared on our website, wacwestma.org, and via email. We are hoping and planning to broadcast those events online in some way, so our virtual audience members from beyond Western Massachusetts should watch for more information about that. If you are not currently on our mailing list, I encourage you to go to our website, again, wacwestma.org, and subscribe to get more information about these and other events. Today's event is being recorded, and thanks to board member Jeremy Cole and JD Cole TV, video will be available on our website and our YouTube channel within a few days. Additionally, audio of this event will be broadcast by Valley Eye Radio to their listeners who are blind, visually impaired, or have some other disability or health condition that makes reading print material difficult. If you would like more information about their service, you can check out their website at valleyeyeradio.org. Our speaker today is author Constantine Pleshakov, and Stephen Jones, professor of Russian studies at Mount Holyoke, will serve as moderator. Many of our longtime members may remember that Dr. Jones has spoken to us before, most recently in 2008 on the Russo-Georgian War. He is an expert on post-communist societies in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and has briefed the U.S. Department of State on a regular basis, as well as a number of U.S. ambassadors to Georgia. His most recent book is Georgia: From Autocracy to Democracy. I'm going to ask you, our audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So we are just going to be reading questions later on. And so I will hand you over now to Dr. Jones and Dr. Pleshakov.
Well, thank you, Cindy. I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing to you Professor Pleshakov. He's a great friend and a long-standing colleague. We taught together at Mount Holyoke College for over 12 years. And while he was there, I got to know him very well and was able to congratulate him on getting the Princeton Review 300 Best College Professors in 2012. So a great teacher as well as a great scholar. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He started his academic career at the School of Asian and African Studies at Moscow State University, where he got his BA and his MA in Confucian philosophy, by the way. And then he completed his academic career in the Soviet Union, getting a Doctor of Science at the Russian Academy of Sciences. The title being Geopolitics and Ideology in the U.S.-Russian-China Strategic Triangle. And as a result of all that work, he became fluent in Mandarin. He's a prolific author. He has published, to my knowledge, at least 7 books. I've used 2 of them in my classes. One was called Inside the Kremlin's Cold War, which was published in 1996. And the latest book, The Crimean Nexus, which deals with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. That was published by Yale University Press. Professor Pleshakov himself comes from Crimea. He's extraordinarily knowledgeable about Ukraine and Crimea, as well as his own home country of Russia. It's with great pleasure, as I say, that I am introducing you to him. He will talk for about half an hour on the current crisis that we're experiencing. And I hope to reserve approximately 30 minutes or so for question and answers. And as Cindy has already said, if you could put your questions in the Q&A, then I can pass them on to Kostya. And again, thanks for the World Affairs Council, the Western Mass, for organizing this. Kostya.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, for your generous introduction. Thank you, Sid. And thank you all for coming. So when Sid and I planned this talk several weeks ago, we called it Russian foreign policy in the 21st century. Well, the 21st century is still there, thank God. Russia is kinda here too, but now Russia is a country, at least that's what I would argue, Russia is a country without foreign policy at the moment. Russia is engaged in a brutal war, definitely the worst event in Europe since 1945. And well, I suppose it's the most dangerous crisis we've seen since 1962. So, still a few words about Russia's foreign policy in the 21st century as it used to be, right? When Vladimir Putin became the Russian leader, at first actually democratically elected, right? He had a vision, he had a strategy in mind. In one sentence, his vision for Russia was to make it a great power again. Of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and throughout the 1990s, Russia remained an important player, but it was a regional power. Putin's idea was to make it a great power as it used to be. Three things he wanted to achieve. He had to achieve, I suppose. So one was to increase the national wealth through exporting more natural resources in more effective ways to more customers. He was assisted in that actually by the fluctuation in global oil and gas prices. He was just lucky. Because throughout the 1990s, when Boris Yeltsin was struggling with Russian economy, oil was dirt cheap. Very soon after Mr. Putin moved into the Kremlin, it started going up. But that said, he managed oil and gas exports very well. He also nationalized a significant section of the industry. Okay. The second idea, the second goal of Russia was to regain control over the post-Soviet space, the former republics of the former Soviet Union. Regain control, different degrees of control. Sometimes direct control, sometimes well, just setting up, puppet regimes or enjoying privileged economic relations with this or that country, or having military bases there. Number three was to create a new system of alliances. Well, that did not work particularly well. There is partnership, close partnership, but problematic partnership with China. For a while, Putin tried to make the so-called BRICS work, Brazil, India, Russia, India, China. So that was not particularly successful. What's going on now? Frankly, I don't think we know what's going on now, and that's the scariest thing. And I will try making myself clear. Mr. Putin has been in power for 20 years, 20 plus years. And in the past, he did many brutal, unfair, ugly things, criminal things in the past. In many cases, well, maybe in most cases, one could argue that for the purposes of his regime, of the dominant minority in the country, that worked. Let's take the annexation of Crimea in 2014, an outrageous act of aggression and of annexation, exactly, right? For the purposes of Mr. Putin and the Kremlin, that worked beautifully. Domestic support, overwhelming domestic support, including, the icon of the West, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. He also was very happy about the annexation of Crimea, and so on and so forth. So many criminal acts, unfair decisions, of course, aggression against Georgia, and so on and so forth. But one could generally find a rational explanation for that, saying that, okay, that's horrible, the guy is a monster, but he knows what he is doing. He is really he's really good in what he is doing. Many experts in the West called him the grand master of geopolitical chess. But what's happening now, the war in Ukraine, frankly, it's impossible to interpret this in irrational terms. There is no chance in hell Russia could win this war, no matter how you define victory. I'll give you a few scenarios. So, number one, let's say Mr. Putin installs a puppet government for Ukraine in Ukraine, right? Pro-Russian fellows who would sign a treaty of friendship, this and that, and we love Russia, Russia loves us. Great. I'm sure he will be able to even, clearly he will be able to help them create a government, maybe even some kind of legislature, who knows. And of course, Russia will be able to keep that government, that legislature, the puppet government safe, right? Okay, so we're talking about, that government quarter surrounded by Russian troops, occupied by Russian troops, guarded by Russian, Air Force, Space Force, whatever. Sure, you can keep this government in place for, if you want to, for 300 more years, right? Doesn't mean anything. So, another option is to keep the vital centers of Ukraine under occupation, even when Russians seize them. I'm talking about the capital area, Kyiv. I'm talking about the number 2 city in the country, Kharkiv. Of course, the coast of the Sea of Azov, the Black Sea. Okay, sure. The Ukrainians are fighting heroically and efficiently. But, Russia clearly, they have the army of 900,000 people and they can mobilize more. So theoretically, yes, Putin could put that, occupational force in Ukraine permanently, for the next few days, weeks, months, years, decades, You know what? By very conservative estimate, to make that occupation possible, he will need 500,000 soldiers. Well, clearly it's a huge strain on the country and the economy, but Ukrainian resistance already now, heavily relies on the tactics of urban guerrilla warfare, underground warfare, right? So any nation, any hostile nation trying to occupy Ukraine, it will pay dearly. Actually, the Germans learned that the hard way during World War II. So if Putin puts, those vital centers of Ukraine under permanent occupation, the number of zinc coffins reaching their families in Russia will be immense. Well, another scenario, let's say that Mr. Putin gets less ambitious and says, all right, I'm just keeping A, B, C, D under occupation. What he could have in mind, he could expand the territory of the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, right? And also he will be very tempted to keep the coast of the Sea of Azov and parts of the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, with the cities of Kherson, Nikolaev, Mariupol, that would, and in the east, the Sea of Azov, that would allow him to maintain a land bridge between the annexed Crimea and mainland Russia. Okay, so let's say he, quote unquote, limits his appetite. So he does not need 500,000 people as an occupying force. Likely he needs, well, at least 100,000. Okay. Same story. Resistance, casualties, and no matter how long Russian troops stay there, 5 years, 50 years, this war will never stop. So I'm sorry, but there is no way Russia could win this war. And that's the first time when Mr. Putin has miscalculated so terribly and so grossly. I'm sure you're following the analysis of the events in the East in the media, and you've read many reports about Mr. Putin's mental health. Could be the case. He could be clinically disturbed. Could be just too long in the royal palace. 20 plus years as a ruler of Russia. Well, most dictators actually, they lose touch. They lose their touch with reality in a while. So whatever is going on, it's irrational. It's self-destructive for Russia. I will talk about the sanctions later on, but what we already see now, right? So Russia is completely isolated on the world arena. China is not terribly happy about what Mr. Putin is doing. As we know, China has been extremely successful in its creeping expansion worldwide. Africa, South Asia, Middle East, Central Asia. But it's quiet, effective, creeping. And here you've got the junior partner who creates this global crisis. Also, now China can forget about the northern part of its extremely ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. Central Asia, Russia, Ukraine, just forget about it. So I don't think that President Xi Jinping of China is a happy camper now. He is not. Post-Soviet space. you must be kidding me. Even countries who are traditionally close to the Russian Federation, like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, well, you know, that's not the kind of partner, even a big brother, they want to see. That's a scary one. So long term, you know, it's I think it's a unique, well, okay, it's a rare situation when it's easier to talk about the long-term consequences. So problems with China, problems, quote unquote, in the post-Soviet space. And yes, what about the national wealth of Russia? Right? Well, we understand that it will take time for the West to afford, you know, new sources of fossil fuels, right? Afford and find them. Okay, you know, it takes time. Right now, what? Germany is dependent on the Russian gas. What? It's like 40% dependency. It's horrible. Well, I'm sorry. Well, okay. No, I can't resist the temptation. Actually, our European friends and allies, well, now they suffer, they say they suffer, but actually this whole story did not start yesterday. The first contracts on fossil fuels exports, first pipelines, we're talking about early 1980s. And President Reagan warned Europeans, said, guys, what are you doing? There's not a provider you will like. Well, you know, no one listened. Hey, you know, Reagan, you know, what does he know? Blah, 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 you know, we can deal with that. With the Soviets, with the Russians, okay, great. Big success, congrats. In any case, okay, you know, I'm done, you know, complaining and whining and bad mouth in Europe. But even Europeans, right? Even Germany, right? They realized that, okay, now we'll cut the losses and we'll gradually move to other providers. So Putin's sales of fossil fuels in the West are more or less kaput. They're not, you know, going down to zero tomorrow, right? But in several years, absolutely. Then what do you have? Well, you know, yes, you know, he is selling, you know, fossil fuels to China, but well, China is already buying that at discount prices. Guess what happens in the future? So, national wealth gone. Okay. So, so as President Joe Biden very aptly described President Putin, he says, well, you know, that's a guy with nukes and no friends. That's basically the long-term outcome of the crisis. So in a sense, one could say that Russia has already lost this war. Yes, 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 yes. That's all extremely, you know, inspiring, but the war has not ended yet. And the scary part is about how it will end. Will it end? And in terms of short-term forecast, hypothesis, any prognostication, it's extremely difficult to say what's going to happen. No one knows that. And I think, you know, the number one reason for that is the current irrationality of the Kremlin, not just of Mr. Putin, right? The dominant minority of Russia. So what are the options? Well, again, that's very general, very tentative. So one option is the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. Well, of course, if he gets enough support inside the country, reaches a deal with Mr. Putin. Well, Ukraine is under immense, stress. Now, stress does not even start explaining their situation, right? It's a country being devastated by a militarily superior neighbor. So whatever compromise Zelensky is willing to offer, well, of course. But, okay, so let's say Zelensky and, supported by the Ukrainian parliament, let's say they tell Mr. Putin, okay, we're signing a treaty with you saying that we'll remain neutral in the future, that we will not join NATO. And yes, perhaps, we agree to postpone the conversation about Crimea, you annexed, the Donbass, that you practically annexed. We postpone that, till later, just leave our territory. So even if that compromise is offered, and you know what, we don't know whether that will satisfy Mr. Putin. Because when the guy started his absolutely crazy diplomatic offensive last December, that was not just about Ukraine. That was about NATO. Basically withdrawing to the 1997 borders. Well, almost, because, he said no NATO troops in the countries that joined NATO after 1997. A demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, whatever that means. So what I'm saying is that even if there is if Ukraine agrees to I wouldn't even call it a compromise, right? But to a partial surrender. How do we know that a week later, the Kremlin won't say, okay, we don't want Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in NATO. Or we don't want American troops in Europe. What do we do next? How do we respond? So, I don't know. No one knows that, but that scenario is absolutely possible. To be brutally honest with you, I think there's just one option that would really resolve the situation. That would happen if Mr. Putin steps down. Let's use this neutral language, and let's say that Russia gets new leadership. That's very likely to be significantly more realistic than Mr. Putin. But that could be just wishful thinking. So to call this the time of great uncertainty would be a huge understatement. I will conclude the talk on a kind of hopeful note, if not optimistic. First, sanctions against Russia. And I'm emphasizing this. Sanctions on Russia, not on Mr. Putin. That's crucial, that's necessary, that's effective. First of all, all sorts of economic sanctions. I don't need to tell this audience what these are. Some of the economic sanctions, they will, their effects will be felt possibly 2, 3, 4 weeks later, but some sanctions are working already now. A month ago, mortgage rates in Russia were around 7%. Now mortgage rates in Russia are up to 20–25%. Furthermore, the banks are saying, the Russian banks are saying that, well, they might revise the existing mortgages, right? So your mortgage goes up to 25. How about it? Nice. Of course, you know, ruble is losing, you know, I don't know, 10% of its value, like, you know, every 2 days. There are other sanctions. The airspace in Europe and North America is closed for Russian airplanes. The Russian planes that are being leased by Russian companies can't travel anywhere because they could be arrested even in Turkey or Dubai. They're leased. Cultural constellations. Many cultural events involving Russians supporting Putin or even being neutral are being cancelled. It's not just about, you know, Putin's poodle, Gergiev, but let's say the Royal Opera in London cancelled the Bolshoi performances. Okay. There are many universities, scientific centers are canceling their exchanges, their research programs in Russia and with Russians. I must applaud the MIT, that was one of the first. So we are talking about a new thing, a blockade of Russia. To be honest with you, I suspect that many people in the audience, if you are still there, of course, I can see you. Many people of the audience are now angry at me. I know I'm saying this because in the past 2 weeks, I've given several interviews and talks on Russia. And each time I say that it's a good thing that we are imposing sanctions on Russia, not just on Putin or the oligarchs. People get angry, some people. What I often hear is that, okay, you can't punish ordinary Russians for the crimes of Putin's regime. Another argument, but there are not just ordinary, but good people in Russia. Let's say, you know, the people who risk their freedom and possibly their lives right now, joining street protests in Moscow, St. Pete, and so on and so forth. And you are right, there are, you know, good people, and they are noble and brave. Okay, now tell me, is there a practical way we could kind of build a safe bubble for the good people in Russia that would protect them against sanctions? No, we can't. It's just not practical, right? You know, it's just impossible to do. So, and I'm sorry, but we are not quite there yet. But there is a parallel with Hitler and Hitler's Germany. Before World War II, during World War II, of course, the Allies fought against the Nazi regime, but it's not like the German people were excluded from the pain, the suffering, and paying the price. I'm sorry, it's how it is. We are in wartime. It's war. Last thing, so that's working. So So sanctions, yes, but weapons to Ukraine. Ukraine is getting more and more weapons from the NATO countries, from different countries, Turkey, even Germany, of course, the United States. And that's very good. Many experts, and of course Russians, they were amazed how successful Ukrainian resistance has been. We don't know the exact number of casualties of Russians, of the Russian military, right? The Russians give a ridiculously low number of 500 people killed, right? The Ukrainian side, I suppose, exaggerates Russian losses. They put it at 12,000. The CIA gives the estimates between 2,000 and 4,000 Russians killed. So if we take that figure, like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 Russians killed in the first 10 days of war, that means in 4 weeks of war, Russia will lose more soldiers than it did in Chechnya. And again, the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian resistance, they're fighting not just heroically, but effectively. So more weapons to Ukraine. And well, I will shut up here. So I'm open to questions. Stephen, I can't hear you. You are on mute.
Kostya, thank you so much for laying this out so clearly, rather depressingly. You know, one of the anxieties that we all have, of course, is, as you're suggesting, that if Russia has already, in some sense, lost the war, what will Putin resort to prevent him losing face and prevent Russia losing credibility in global politics, right? Losing its status and its power. And one of the questions here that we have addresses this issue. It's from Terence Smith. He says, what does it mean that Putin has put his nuclear forces on high alert? Will he be likely to drop the bomb?
Oh God. I must say that I share the view of those American experts who say that he might. That's not terribly likely. Why I'm saying this? Not terribly likely. Okay, I will be honest with you. It's my impression that for once at least, the intelligence community of the United States knows what they talk about. Their predictions concerning the Russian invasion, they sounded absolutely fantastic. No one believed, well, few people believed them, but they proved to be absolutely accurate. So I suppose our intelligence community has some reliable sources in Moscow, and it does not seem like the administration is, I mean, Biden's administration is, terrified. So what means that Putin put his forces on high alert? Well, first of all, clearly it's a PR measure, right, to the Russians and to the world, but hopefully it does not mean anything in terms of big war, but this comes with a horrible catch, right? Well, it's unlikely that anything really, big will start, but Russia still may use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. it may.
Yes, I mean, I guess this is clearly one of the questions that we don't know what's going on in Putin's mind. We do know there must be some protocols in place to when he decides to press that button. We don't know how effective those protocols would be in preventing it happening. But the next question by Ken first raises a different issue. To what extent was the West itself culpable for getting us into this situation? So the question is this: do you think the West could have or should have prepared Ukraine more effectively with more arms, or even temporarily stationing NATO troops in Ukraine to have dissuaded Putin from invading? In other words, has the West acted too little and too late? And could it have done something earlier to warn Putin of the disaster that he was contemplating?
My answer would be that actually, I think that the U.S. did a lot in Ukraine, very quietly. If you, well, you know, in the past few days, there were several articles investigated, researched, and published by Western journalists that reveal, well, many interesting programs of quiet assistance, training, intelligence sharing between the United States and Ukraine. And if you compare the performance of the Ukrainian military now to how they performed in 2014 during the occupation of Crimea, you are talking about two different armies. Now it's hard to believe, but in 2014, Crimea fell without bloodshed. There were just a few shots exchanged, but it was bloodless. The Ukrainian military in Crimea just did not fight. Now it's a different situation, not just because of US instructors and classified programs, but definitely I'm sure that the United States has contributed significantly to the Ukrainian army. The weapons. It's, well, you know, it's impossible nowadays, you know, to ship significant amounts of weapons like anti-tank missiles or anti-aircraft missiles to a foreign country without, you know, the world knowing about that. So we did supply significant numbers of anti-tank, actually, you know, portable missiles, the Javelins, to Ukraine in the past few years. But could we have done more? Our fear, and a justified fear, was that that would give Putin a pretext to invade. Of course, now you can say, hey, he invaded all the same. And yes, you will be right, but I don't think that you could blame US or NATO for being too careful in the past 2 or 3 years.
So let me add to the question by Ken first and be a bit more specific. As you know, there are arguments out there that suggest the crucial trigger, if you like, for Putin's anti-Western actions and his increasing paranoia about Russian security was stimulated by the expansion of NATO. A policy that was pursued under the Clinton administrations and subsequent US administrations. Do you think that argument has any credibility, that if, for example, as Gorbachev suggested, there was some sort of agreement that NATO would not expand eastwards, if that agreement had actually been kept to, would we be in this situation today? Thank you, Stephen. That's one of the most important questions, you know,
one could have asked. Yes and, well, okay, yes and no. So now I will explain why I'm so ambivalent about all this thing. I do think that a NATO eastward expansion was a colossal stupidity. And I remember I already lived in the United States in the 1990s, and I remember one of the great wise men of U.S. foreign policy, George Kennan. He was in his 90s at the point. He came out of retirement to say that NATO expansion is a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. He said that this kind of action will bring militarism back to Russia. And it did. However, how do we know that had there been no NATO expansion, there would have been no Putin in the Kremlin? So but staying on the NATO theme, so I agree with those experts and diplomats, retired or not, or well, retired. Active diplomats don't share their thoughts, or they become retired. So I agree with those who say that it was a colossal stupidity. But it proceeded in stages. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, okay. The Baltics, problematic. But when in 2008, George W. Bush, as we now know, against the advice of his national security team, said that Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO, that was a huge mistake. Well, yes, it angered Putin, it angered Russians, but the saddest thing is that Bush was giving a promise that NATO was not going to keep. So it made many people in Ukraine and in Georgia believe that their future could be safer, more secure if they become NATO countries. But it was just not realistic to think that NATO would ever accept them as new members. And I'm sorry, just very quickly, frankly, this, well, NATO, the situation of NATO at the moment, right, is clearly extremely difficult. So President Joe Biden, leaders of NATO, they keep saying that we're not sending troops into Ukraine, but if Mr. Putin invades any NATO country, we'll respond, we'll fight. Sounds beautiful, but I'm sorry to be so pragmatic. Let's say in near future, Russia invades Latvia. Latvia has a huge Russian population, around 30%. Let's say people living in the industrial areas of Latvia create Latvian People's Republic, and Putin will support it. So that will violate the territorial integrity of a NATO country. I'm sorry, will the United States fight Russia over Latvia? Well, the answer is probably yes, but the devil is in the detail. We keep referring to Article 5. Article 5 of NATO, one for all and all for one. But as well, maybe everyone knows that. But the Article 5 comes with a fine print. It says that if one member of the alliance is under attack, all other members of the alliance are obliged to come to that country's help by any means they deem necessary, including military force. So yes, you are obliged to help, but you're not obliged to fight. So the American diplomats who crafted the NATO charter in 49, they were smart people. But in practical terms, this means that even Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, NATO membership possibly, very likely, didn't really make them much safer, feel much safer. So, okay, if, God forbid, something, happens there, I'm sorry, but let's say France possibly will just send thoughts and prayers and some chocolates. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but no.
Okay, Kostya. So here's another question. You pointed out, I think, that there is a difference between Putin and Russian people more generally, right? In terms of, who do we sanction, for example, and what effect would it have, right? Putin is sitting on top of a vertical system, at the top of a pyramid, right? With absolute power, essentially, although less so as we see when it comes to foreign policy, because clearly he doesn't have much power over economic sanctions or the resistance of Ukrainians, but domestically at home, he has absolute power. And as you say, partly as a result of this, he's probably become somewhat isolated, well, he is totally isolated, and somewhat paranoid about his situation. So one of the questions here from John Adams is, can you imagine or describe a few possible scenarios in which Putin will be challenged and possibly fall? Is that a realistic scenario?
It is a realistic scenario. Sure, the sanctions are hitting everyone in Russia, but the Russian elite, the dominant minority, right? They are not accustomed to any kind of loss, material loss or hardship. So it's unimaginable that people on top, especially the people, the business people or people who run those state capitalism enterprises or other privileged people in Russia, that they don't feel anger and frustration. So we have no idea how the very top of Russia functions, right? And it's not impossible that Mr. Putin really exists in an ironclad proof, absolutely secure, impenetrable bubble. Possible. But still there is a big possibility, but still, there is a chance that the Russians on top can do something about this. I'm just not prepared to talk about the possible scenarios because it would be just irresponsible. We don't know how this may happen or whether it will happen or not, but at least, but a few Russian so-called oligarchs, well, under sanctions, of course, they already called for, well, they already issued statements saying that this war should stop. Yes, they're still kind of, fighting against the war, not against Mr. Putin, but that's a start. And again, sanctions went into full force like 8 days ago. Let's give it some time. But I know that, of course, the people of Ukraine suffer terribly while we wait for something to change in Moscow.
Another question, Kostya. You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis as a comparative event, if you like, when the United States almost came to war with the Soviet Union. And the question here is from Ron Hirsch. Is there a comparison, he argues, between the situation now and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we possibly would go to war if Russian missiles were on our doorstep? I think the supplementary thought behind that is also, this is Putin's argument, right? Missiles close to Russia, threatening Russian security. How would we react if we faced the same scenario?
Yes, thank you. And of course, that's a great question. And as we remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended partially because, the United States agreed to quietly withdraw its missiles from Turkey a bit later on, right? The thing is, President Joe Biden's administration has already offered that several times. Because what's going on now? There used to be a treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States regulating the so-called medium and shorter range missiles. Trump's administration, in its wisdom, walked out of that treaty. And a new treaty along the same lines would be a great thing. And actually, immediately after Mr. Putin started making all those interesting noise in December about NATO missiles being on Russia's borders, almost immediately, the United States said, yes, sure, let's talk about that. First of all, we don't have medium-range missiles on your borders now. You say that the two anti-missile defense complexes we maintain, one in Poland, one in Romania, that they could be easily modified and used not for defense, but for launching missiles. Okay, let's figure out how you can monitor the situation. We're ready to give you access to those sites. We're ready to discuss with you a new big treaty on medium-range missiles in Europe. So the United States actually tried applying the Cuban Missile Crisis solution to this one. Putin wouldn't buy that.
Okay, Kostya, I think we've run out of time. It's 1 o'clock. And I do apologize to everyone if I hadn't got to your questions. There were 4 or 5 more that were really interesting and would have stimulated great conversation, but we ran out of time. So I want to thank Kostya again very much for a very stimulating conversation. I'm glad it was a conversation rather than a lecture as such. I think that sort of approach allows us to reflect and think more clearly. So thank you, Kostya, again, and I'm going to hand it over now to Cynthia, and Cynthia will wrap up.
May I have just 30 more seconds? How we can help Ukraine? So there are dozens of ways you can transfer money to Ukraine, or organizations working in Ukraine or with Ukrainian refugees in Europe. Many organizations, and if you can even choose, a particular cause, you can even, there are links allowing you to help people in Ukraine who now try running animal shelters, right? On the other end of the spectrum, there are links that allow you to crowdfund Western volunteers, ex-military guys with skills who go to Ukraine now as people used to go to Spain in the 1930s, so on and so forth. And last thing, possibly it's obvious, but I will still say this. If you have friends in Russia, I would suggest don't ask them what they think about this war. It's not just that you might encounter some hostile reaction that's going to spoil your relationship, but people in Russia could be under surveillance, and so it's better not to discuss politics with them. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Kostya, for reminding us. Yeah, I subscribe to the Ukrainian Red Cross, so that's one possibility. Yeah. Okay, Cynthia.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an excellent program on a very tough topic, and I appreciate both of you. And thank you again to our audience for sharing time with us. And again, keep an eye open. We will have more programming on timely topics coming up soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.